We were really lucky last year to have 2 teachers from Shanghai and Bristol for the month, and they taught in 2 nearby schools where colleagues work, and I went with 2 colleagues from this school to see them, and it gave us a lot of food for thought. There was so much about their practice that we would love to emulate and hopefully will over time, but we knew that importing their model all at once, whole scale, just wasn't a realistic way to go with developing maths in school. So the first thing we did was we decided we were going to help teachers think about differentiating through depth rather than acceleration for our highest attainers. So we had an inset day on that, and we set up a load of different activities and different ways of thinking about depth. We used the NCTM Assessing for Mastery materials quite a lot to support us with that as well. So one of the things, for example, we wanted teachers to do was think about the idea of stories, the cars in the car park, the structure, the part-whole model, the counters, and the symbols, 5 subtract 3 equals 2, or whatever it is. And we did a lot on working with teachers on that and getting them to think about how they could use structural representations, structural arithmetic in their lessons to support their teaching as one way of differentiating through depth. And there's various other ways that we've kind of worked with teachers on doing that as well. Our first expectation was that that depth first. So we said, right, after that inset day, can everyone make sure that the first thing they try and do is differentiate for those high retainers through depth rather than acceleration? As subject leader, I've also, for each half term, worked with a particular year group to support them with teaching for mastery. One thing that we do a lot is co-planning and planning in depth together. I'm really lucky that I've got a lot of teachers here who really enjoy thinking about the maths itself and the perfect way to introduce the maths for the children. And our planning discussions are very much discussions about the mathematics. And yes, and at the end it gets put into a lesson form and at a very high level planning format. But when I'm planning with year groups, we're thinking about the very, very small steps of progression and the coherent progression, which is just absolutely central to the teaching for mastery approach. And then as subject leader, I kind of working with each year group for half a term. And at the moment, we're 1 year into what's probably going to be at least a 5-year path to getting mastery where we want it in the school. So teachers are then choosing which elements of mastery they want to work on within their classrooms. So, and while there's a lot of commonalities across the school, there'll also be some individual elements that individual teachers are taking and developing. Our next steps will be at the end of this year to see where we are across the schools, what's working well in year groups, where there's particular strengths with particular elements of teaching for mastery, and then decide on 2 or 3 more whole school expectations we want to have in terms of developing our maths style to a mastery teaching approach. One thing that we've realised is just how powerful the model of same-day catch-up is, which the Chinese do. So the marking is tick and flick. It takes 5 minutes, a pile of ones that get it, a pile of ones that don't, and then they whip them out for 5 minutes in the afternoon and go over it. Corrective teaching, so that by the time they come into the next lesson there are no misconceptions, or there's difficulty points have been addressed and the children are ready to move on in their learning. That's just not something we have built into our timetable at all this year, and is something that we really need to think about going into next year. Our year 3s are trying to move timetables around a bit to try see how they can fit in, catch up and keep up teaching for those children who've struggled in the lesson. But as a subject leader, that's one of the big things that I'm thinking about going forward, and one of the conversations we'll be having with senior leadership team about what flexibility we have to build that in as a standard model across the school. I think one of the main benefits is the strength of mathematical learning for all pupils. Children that have struggled with maths through the school, we're really seeing huge steps forward in their understanding of maths and their success in maths and their enjoyment of maths. But equally for the higher attainers, I think it's a huge benefit in ways of teaching, helping them have that depth of mathematical connections. One of the groups I've been involved with the last few years is ACME, the Advisory Committee for Maths Education, and it's really struck me that at every point of transition, whether moving from primary to secondary or GCSE to A-level or A-level to university, teachers and university lecturers always say, oh, well, we get them in with A's, but of course they can't really do the maths. They've just learned how to go through the process. They don't really understand the maths. And that's really given me the confidence that I really think this is the right thing for our highest attainers as well. There's a very small percentage of children in the country that will go on to do a maths degree, but the message coming from universities is even of those children, there's some who don't have the depth of understanding they need. And that's really made me think very differently about the experience of those high attaining children and what we can do here to slow their learning down and make it much deeper and much richer so that they are in as well placed as possible to go on enjoying maths and succeeding at maths for as long as they possibly can. One of the things that the planning in small steps and mastery does allow you to do, I guess, is maybe have a little bit more confidence that the children have got the building blocks that they need to understand a concept. So I guess maybe in earlier in my career, if there were stages at a lesson when I just felt a child wasn't getting something, I would have questioned much more whether they had the building blocks, whereas the advantage of this way of teaching is that you really try and secure all the building blocks for all children so that you know that the new thing they're learning really is just one more thing and you're not having to worry about whether they've got massive gaps missing underneath, which I guess probably gives me a bit more kind of tenacity to stick with a child and really thinking they can do this and trying to explain them and get them really fluent on that in the lesson. I think the biggest challenge is probably developing the level of pedagogical subject knowledge that it probably takes to teach really effectively in this way. And that's something we've done a lot of work on. I've talked a little bit about co-planning and really understanding planning in the wider sense of the word planning, a discussion about the mathematics. But equally, when we have maths staff meetings, we really try and make those about the maths. And I really think if you're not having conversations about the maths itself, you're not going to get dramatic improvements in outcomes in maths. So while the Chinese have a lot of things in their system that make it a lot easier for them to attain kind of great pedagogical subject knowledge, I really do genuinely think there's lots of things we can do within the confines of our system to improve teacher subject knowledge. We're lucky that we've got teachers who enjoy, I guess, reflecting on their way they teach. And actually, I find that informal conversations over lunch are actually often as powerful as anything. Somebody talking about an element that went wrong in a particular lesson or that they struggled to explain, and then other year groups picking that up, and actually seeing the links in learning through the schools and how year 5 will relate what they're doing to year 1. That's been really powerful. And you can't force your teachers to sit down and talk about maths over lunch, but I think as a subject leader, bringing the conversations that you have around to that with teachers and focusing it on that does help to develop people's willingness to have those conversations. I think that understanding how to differentiate through depth has been a really big pedagogical challenge for us, and is probably actually the biggest pedagogical challenge for our teachers. And we've really developed our understanding of that. But I don't want to kind of underestimate what a big challenge it is and how I think it's something that within our staff we've done a lot of professional development on and will continue to do so. We've also been using textbooks to support our teacher subject knowledge, because often we find that the learning objectives of the national curriculum are very broad, and actually what you need is a really clear understanding of the small steps of progression within that. And textbooks have been a great way to support us with that. The children have no idea we're using textbooks. They're not using textbooks. They're not actually seeing any textbooks. To us, the textbooks are like a teacher guide to support them with thinking through a series of lessons and then the journey of an individual lesson. So we just have one textbook per teacher, which hasn't been huge expense and has been really, really invaluable in helping support our teachers with planning and thinking about the mathematics. I found increasingly over the last year, I've really been asking the children to explain what things represent. So I will ask them, can you tell me what the digit in this number, what does the digit 1 represent? What does this digit represent? And that's something the children have got really quite confident about doing. And I think it's good for all children actually, because I think it does help the children that have historically been our high attainers make connections, because actually sometimes I realise now that they've just been kind of working with number patterns and they can see what happens to numbers when you do things with them, but actually don't always quite know why that's happening. And I think for the lower attainers, it's helps support them in making sense what just looks like a load of numbers that they might not know what to do with. If they have that context, it helps them write it. So, for example, if they can say this is 6/10, and they know where the tenths is, it will help them to write that. Whereas otherwise, without that focus on what each of the digits represents, what might seem very obvious to us, like 6/10 being written as 0.6, can become quite a struggle for some of those children. I think one of the big changes in my thinking has been really thinking very specifically about representations, and in particular, I think now of the representation as something that the teacher needs to plan really carefully to draw out the element of the maths that I want to be drawn out. So normally it's me deciding on the representation that we will use, and then the children trying to make meaning of that. In the Year 4 lesson, we represented tenths with measures for kilograms, and specifically practically they had metre rules in front of them, and that's something I've got from kind of reading around practice in Japan, that I think they use quite extensively measures to teach place value, and something that has been quite powerful through the school. So although we're also using deans and we'll move on to place value counters, understanding 10 tenths as 10 tenths of a metre has really helped the children have a kind of context of that and can see that 10 tenths is equivalent to 1 whole. And at this stage, we're still using those representations before we move to a further level of abstraction. I guess another thing I've kind of thought about more is that the numbers, I guess, also represent mathematics and represent the structure as well. So when we write 1.2, that actually also is a representation, and I'm not sure that's something I'd really thought about before. In the lesson, I really wanted the children to understand that 1 represents 1 whole and 2 represents 2 tenths, and make the connections between the notation of the number on the page and the structure of the number mathematically. Yes, so I wanted to bring those two things together. One of the very big differences is that you're essentially teaching to the whole class, and to a certain extent it looks like everybody is doing the same thing, and to a certain extent we are all doing the same thing. We're all working on tenths. In kind of previous life, I would have had my higher attainers moving on to hundredths within about 10 minutes of starting a unit on decimals, but we're all going to work on tenths. And the needs of the children are addressed in different ways. So the children who would have struggled to keep up are supported by small bits of teaching and small bits of practice, small bits of teaching, small bits of practice, as well as incredibly carefully thought through representations, which hopefully help them really make sense of the structure of the mathematics. The needs of the children who would have been the higher retainers, or the children that are picking up the maths quickly, they're met through depth challenges and being expected to think about things slowly and at depth and make connections. And that's how they're challenged to do that. It was quite interesting when I kind of started kind of teaching for mastery. Some of the children that had been on higher attainers really took to that and kind of loved the challenge of it, and others, it really made me realise quite how often they'd been going kind of almost through the motions about doing stuff with numbers, and almost kind of relying on patterns with numbers, which was great, but not always understanding quite why they were doing what they were doing. And as I've said, we know that lots of children do really well through maths and then suddenly go off a cliff in terms of their level of attainment. And I really think that the needs of the high retainers are met this way. I mean, as a parent myself, wherever my children turn out to be on the kind of maths attainment spectrum and their enjoyment of maths, this is absolutely the way I would want my child to be taught maths. To me, it just makes perfect sense. One quite key feature is the structure of the lesson is different. So there's a lot more forward and back. I do, you practice. That's, I think, is really helpful, actually particularly for lower attainers. So this idea that we're going to work on a problem together for 5 minutes, discuss it and draw out some learning, and then they're going to go and have a chance to apply it, is really kind of powerful one for them, and then come back for a second part of the lesson, learn a bit more, and then reapply that. And that's a really different lesson structure to how we kind of taught under a kind of national strategies type lesson, and is something that for me has been a bit of a revelation in realising quite how much some of those children can keep up, and actually beyond keep up can actually excel as well. I think for me the big thing that's changed in my kind of understanding of teaching for mastery is really now having an idea of how teaching can address all of the needs of those children. There's still differentiation taking place within the classroom, absolutely, but it's just a very different way to how we've thought about it before. So the support for the children that have struggled with maths historically comes in the form of the very careful thinking of the scaffolding of learning and the very small steps. So the scaffolding of the learning through representations and STEM sentences, for example, and also the very small steps about introducing kind of one new thing at a time and relating it back to their learning, and then giving them time for kind of immediate practice in the lesson. So historically we might have had a 20-minute input where we would have gone through a range of work for all the different attainment levels, and then we would have had 3 different options for independent work. And actually what we found is that the children that historically had been choosing the easiest work and the lowest attainers, actually by doing a little bit of work and then consolidating it immediately, are able to move on to work that previously they probably wouldn't have been accessing, and unable to master that.